Um, okay, couple other thoughts here. Jerry Rice had he went on 95.7 the game, and Jerry said something that I totally agree with, and I want to share the screen on this.
Is it about goat fuel?
No, it wasn't about goat fuel. But it's about signing Brock Purdy, and he said an emphatic message about the whole thing. And here he is with Joe Shasky and Spadoni, the replacement for Bonte.
The Niners feel like they have their quarterback in Brock Purdy. Now, we've seen how they've done deals in the past, and last year, and it hasn't been about the quarterback, but Brandon Ayuk, we saw it linger, right? Didn't go well for Brandon last year. We saw it Trent Williams. The contract lingered. We've seen it in the past, Debo, Nick Bosa, et cetera, et cetera. Is it more imperative now more than ever for the 49ers to get this deal done with Brock Purdy sooner rather than later?
They need to get it done now. They don't want any distractions this year. I think they learned their lesson from last year. The best thing, if you feel like Brock Purdy is the quarterback of the Niners, get it done. Don't let it linger into training camp and all of that. So my thing is though, but you got to be sure. You got to be positive. You cannot make a mistake like that if you don't feel like this guy is completely what you need. Because if you do that, there's no coming back from that. I believe from just watching him, I believe he is the guy. I believe he can, he done taken us to the Super Bowls, and he has taken us to the Super Bowl and done all of those things. And now the 49ers just got to make sure they get this done before training camp.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think all Niner fans are with you. Like they want to see this guy in red and gold for a long time.
All right.
Dynamite drop in. That broadcast school is really paying off. Sorry.
Some excellent questions.
I mean,
isn't
Jerry the master of the obvious right there? I mean, he's saying they got to be sure. Jerry, what are they going to do? Sign Sam Darnold? I mean, all due respect to the goat and goat fuel and goat necklaces and everything else, Jerry, but that's the whole thing with quarterbacks, right, Krug? Is there's nothing. You don't have a choice. You're paying great to good. That's just the way that the league is. Darnold's either going to be with the Vikings or the Raiders or something like that. They're not going to decide that Sam Darnold's the guy. They're not going to go out and draft a quarterback. Daniel Jones might be the rehab project. The question, I guess what I'm saying is that beyond.
I got no problem with what Jerry said, and I agree with Jerry.
I don't either, but I'm just saying that, like, aren't we beyond the conversation that they're making the decision? Like Jerry said, well, they've got to be sure. They got to be sure what, Jerry? Like, it's done. Like, now it's just, it's the timing of it. It's not whether it's going to get done.
He's saying that he's going to get the big bag. What he's saying is he's going to get the big bag. They're getting ready to pay this guy the big bag, and he knows it. And, he himself says, I mean, it's weird that he phrased it that way, because then he himself is like, hey, I think he is the guy. And I do too. I think he is the guy. And I'd put my I don't know, my name to it. I mean, whatever that means. I do think Brock's good enough to win a championship with. It's funny too, because I was watching the Super Bowl the other day, like the Super Bowl marathon, right? And I actually started. I've seen the Super Bowl marathon so many times,
right.
in the past, as far as all the they show them all at once. But I always pick it up in the middle, right? It's like, oh, hey, look, they're doing a Super Bowl marathon. They're on 32, whatever.
Did you watch one of the ones that was on today? Because me and you were right next to each other at it.
No, today I just wanted to watch 1 through 10 or 1 through 16 leading into the Niners. Okay.
Got you.
So I taped 1 through 16 and decided to watch 1 through 16. And obviously
was that in one sitting?
Well, no. I taped it on Saturday. I watched like 2 or 3 hours Saturday. I watched 2 or 3 hours on Sunday. So I've watched, they're each half hour long. Each Super Bowl is a half hour long. So it's not, it's not 3 hours long.
Nice.
Could you imagine if it was 3 hours long? But I'll say it. There are two things, though, that I thought were worthy of mentioning about this that I actually thought was kind of cool. One, if you go back to Super Bowl I, right? And this is the Green Bay Packers in the LA Coliseum beating the Kansas City Chiefs, okay? If you go back to Super Bowl I, you know what you see? Tons of empty seats. Now, the LA Coliseum is massive.
Oh, yeah,
It's a massive, massive stadium. So, it probably fills 100,000. But there were tons of empty seats at Super Bowl I. In Super Bowl II, which was Green Bay beating the Raiders, that game was watched by, I'm looking for, I made a note on it. I'm trying to find my note. But that game was watched by so many people. It's like from year 1 to year 2 was like night and day. Okay, here it is. Plenty of empty seats in the LA Coliseum in Super Bowl I. But Super Bowl II, 70 million people watched. 1/3 of the total U.S. population at the time viewed Super Bowl II, with Green Bay beating the Raiders in Miami 33-14 in the Orange Bowl. This was Vince Lombardi's last game with the Packers. He retired after a couple months later. But isn't that amazing? They went from empty seats in the Coliseum in the first game to 70 million people watching it in year 2. I mean,
and then year 3, everything changed. When the Jets beat the Colts
beat the Colts in Super Bowl
because nobody
3.
thought the AFL would ever beat the NFL, and Joe was flamboyant and wearing furs, and then he did the guarantee, that potentially the greatest moment in the league was something off the field, because Joe Namath authored a guarantee when this thing was just starting up.
Yeah.
And people went, what? And it was in New York, and they beat the mighty NFL, and all of a sudden it was born. It was on. Because then it was like, well, these are two actually leagues that are going to compete. Then they merged, and the NFL became the NFL. And like you said, then the rest is history. Then we couldn't get enough. Like this Sunday,
Super Bowl 4 was Hank Stram's Chiefs beating the Vikings, I believe.
They smoked them 23-7. They smoked.
And it was,
he was laughing on the sideline. He smoked.
It was January 11th, 1970.
Isn't that wild? Long it now?
And that was the day before I was born.
Is that
the day before I was born January 12th, 1970. The Super Bowl was January 11th, 1970. Hank Stram. Let's matriculate the ball down the field, boys.
And that was a great. That's what you don't want these Niners to become, because that Vikings team, I mean, Hall of Famers. That whole defensive line was Hall of Fame. Carl Eller, Alan Page, Jim Marshall. They had Fran Tarkington. I mean, they were awesome, and they never won a Super Bowl, so nobody ever talks about them. They were awesome, but they got, like you said, they got beat by the Raiders. They got beat by the Chiefs. They got beat by the Steelers 16-6 one year. I mean, they were in it all the time. They never won.
But back to the Jerry quote, because I wanted to talk about with this Jerry thing was just that I agree with Jerry for not that his whole thing. Well, he better be the guy. And Jerry said that he believes he's the guy. I believe Brock's the guy, but I also think that the Niners have to get this thing done with Purdy soon. Now, I've talked about different deadlines, and I've heard different people say, oh, you got to get it done. You can't let it linger. But then everybody's got a different definition of what got to get it done means as far as deadline. I personally think, John, that if the Niners are going to actually maybe go after a premier guy in free agency like a T. Higgins or add a Chris Dahlman, I think you got to get Brock, which is going to be your biggest contract. You got to get that finalized out of the way and know how much you have for the rest of your team. Otherwise, you're flying blind. I think the unofficial deadline should be March 12th. You got to get it finalized before you can go into free agency and decide how you're going to build out your roster. Do you not? I mean, or you better have a real good idea of where that contract is going to sit, so you have a pretty good idea of how much you want to spend on a receiver. Because I mean, if they might be all in on a T. Higgins, and when I first heard that, I thought, nah, that doesn't sound right. But you know what?
Wasn't that
when
just
I started
Lombardi
looking at the receiver market and their situation?
Wasn't that Lombardi just spitballing that whole thing, and then it got blown out?
But I personally think it makes a lot of sense because I don't think that the 49ers, I know the 49ers want to win a Super Bowl. I know they want to contend for a Super Bowl next year. I know that their receivers next year very easily could be Ricky Pearsall and Juwan Jennings, and I know that's not good enough. And then I'm looking at the draft and I'm going, well, they'll just get somebody in the draft, but there's nobody in the draft really outside of McMillan falling to them that could really impact their situation. It's a lousy year.
But they made their bed now at receiver because what they have to do is they've got to fix their lines. And so if I'm looking at the Niners right now, you gave Jennings the money and he should have got 1,000, and T. Higgins is a little bit like him, although he's faster and more athletic and those kind of things. But you decided on Jennings, you decided to draft Pearsall, you decided, which was a bad move, on giving the money to Ayuk, and you've got to figure out Debo, which I think they're going to trade at some particular point. But I mean, year 3, you took one in the first round, you gave another one $30 million, and you paid Jennings. Now, if you want to move Jennings, then Higgins would make sense. If your receivers are Ayuk and Higgins and Pearsall, and Debo gets moved and Jennings gets moved, that makes sense. But Higgins is kind of Jennings-ish because he's that bigger receiver, and I wouldn't mind that for Brock. And I agree with you. He's going to bounce back. I mean, I don't understand. This is more nationally driven. He was missing a bunch of guys on his team. He tried to do too much. With his limited physical skills, as good as he can be, he cannot do too much. That's the opposite of what Brock Purdy needs to do. And as a whole, they had a bad year, and he did too. Get everybody together. And the biggest reason he needs to sign that contract, I think that Parag is one of the best in the league at massaging this whole thing. They've got a really good idea of what they're going to pay Brock for that first year, and then from there, where it will go. But I think, and they'll overvalue that first year to save money. So to a point, it's important from a financial sense. And I get what you're saying, to kind of build the base of the house before you then give money to other people. You want to buy your biggest thing first, right? Because then you find yourself going, well, I have to have that, but then I just spent all the money on booze. Damn it. I just drank and did all this stuff, and now I got to pay rent. And I already drank all the booze. Now I'm short on rent. I mean, that's not the greatest analogy I've ever come up with, but you got to pay the big bills first is the whole point. An alcoholic would say those kind of things, but you got to pay the big bills first. I totally understand. But to me, the biggest reason why Brock needs to get in ASAP is because he was never on the same page with Ayuk, and he was never on the same page with Pearsall, and he was never, people think that that's overvalued. When people have to understand that when it's 3rd and 4 and there's 2 300-pound men wanting to crush your face, and you've got to make a split-second decision, and maybe Brock can't see it, he's got to think to himself, all that work that I put in with Pearsall and Jennings and Ayuk, they're going to be where they're supposed to be, and I got to throw this thing sometimes blindly. And certainly in Brock's case, this is what made Brock great: anticipatory throws. So he's got to believe that he's going to make that throw. He doesn't know if Ayuk's open, but he sees that the safety's playing with inside leverage, so he's going to throw it outside. And Ayuk better read the same thing, and Ayuk better be out there. And the only way you do that is to do it in the offseason again and again and again. And when Ayuk cuts inside on a leverage that he should cut outside, Purdy throws the interception and then says to him, hey, bro, remember, we've worked on this. When Ayuk, even if it's just for the amount of time he was off last year, and with Pearsall not being in training camp, he was never on the same page with these guys. And they have to work it again and again every single year. And they never on the same page. So Debo can't get open. Ayuk's gone. Pearsall's not in camp. You just throw it up and hope Jennings can go get it. And Kittle's your really most consistent receiver, and you have no outlet out of the backfield to McCaffrey. And then people say, why do you have a bad year? And oh, by the way, the interior of the offensive line was laying on its back half the time. And then it was, God, Purdy sucks. Why is Purdy not good? Why is Purdy throwing interceptions? Why is Purdy throwing into double coverage against the Rams down the right sideline? Because he has to do too much, and he's not on the same page. And the O-line's, you get all this.
How about the people trying to say, hey, man, it's not the O-line's fault. Look, his average time to throw is 3.05. Last year it was 2.48. It's like, you morons. He's watching the games.
Holding on to the ball longer is not good.
He's running to a new platform to try to buy more time because things are breaking down. It's
just easy to blame the quarterback.
He was really noticeable in Week 7 against Kansas City. I mean, Spags sped him up. There's no question about it. Purdy at the end of the game was like, hey, man, he admitted. He was like, hey, he got sped up by Spags.
That was as close as I've heard anyone say they saw ghosts. I mean, he was going down the Sam Darnold, I'm seeing ghosts thing. He didn't say it, but that's the kind of game it was, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I personally, I think Brock obviously regressed this year, but I think I saw on Super Bowl Sunday, what kind of player he actually is. And I just really believe that if they could build a fortress around him, get a few more explosive weapons, increase their defensive line significantly, and add some speed on defense, I think you could be looking at a quarterback that could win multiple Super Bowls and be a very, very successful 49er quarterback. And I people only see things as they are. And right now, he's operating behind a pretty mediocre line, if you want to call it that, with weapons that have big names but not a lot of speed, on a defensive line that's a shadow of what it used to be, with a defense that's relatively slow compared to what I would want to build. And I just think overall, it's easy to point to Shanahan and Purdy because that's the head of the snake in the NFL. But in reality, it's probably a little bit more nuanced than that, to be completely fair about it.